Hello and welcome to Booklust. I'm Nancy Pearl. My guest today is Leah Hager Cohen, and we'll be talking about her books, old and new, but especially her brand new book, To and Fro. Leah, it's so nice to see you again.
Thank you, Nancy. You too.
So when I read To and Fro, I thought I could see that it was your book because the things that you're interested in are in the book, but it's it's published in an interesting way so that I'm going to hold the book up to the camera so that you could read it with the blue cover or you could read it with the, I guess, gold cover. Talk about, and how do you describe the book when you were talking to your agent? How did you describe the book?
Yeah, so that unusual format suggested itself to me when I was maybe midway through working on this book. That was such a challenging book for me to write because, I don't think of myself as an experimental writer, and yet I found myself writing something that felt formally and to a certain extent thematically it was a divergence from the type of writing I have done in the past. And many times I felt that I was in over my head and I didn't know what to do with this material. And at some point in the process, when I realized I was writing two related narratives with two young female protagonists set in completely different worlds, um, I I understood that these two narratives and these two girls were in relationship to each other, not in a way that felt as though they were sort of moving along parallel routes. But the movement I felt was not parallel. It was this. It was these two girls and their stories reaching, yearning toward each other. And and that's when, I sort of maybe woke up one morning or in the middle of the night with this sense, oh, that's what the object of the book would want to be. It would want to represent that movement towards. And so, but I was like, oh no, that's super gimmicky. Could never really do that. But I mentioned it to my agent and he said, yeah, no, I get it. Um, so that's, I could say more, but that's sort of how the idea emerged.
And did you write when you were working on it before you came to that realization of the sort of movement toward one another? And one of the other experimental parts of the book is that when you get to the end of each story, you can see that one goes on this way and then you turn it and the other goes on that way. Did you write one of these stories first, one of the parts first?
Yeah, so the book began with my playing with sort of writing in response to this very short Kafka parable. Um, and the parable had for years kind of intrigued me and mystified me, and I kept thinking about it. And I just found myself writing from the perspective of an imagined character who doesn't appear in Kafka's original, but I sort of imagined someone overhearing this snippet of dialogue and being just impelled to start off on a journey in pursuit of Kafka's man who's going off on a journey. Um, it was so much fun, Nancy. It felt like crazy and playful, and I was cracking myself up. It was so different and in a weird way, light of spirit. And yet, and on the other hand, it's Kafka. So it's at once like light and dark and heavy. Um, and I went, I maybe was 50 pages in and completely hit a wall and thought, I'm not a smart enough person or a good enough writer to do that. What am I doing? I'm not up to the task. And I was miserable. And for months I didn't write. And I just thought, that's it. I give up. And then this other story began sort of pressing at my consciousness. And I began to write what became the beginning of the Fro story in the book about the other young female protagonist. And at that point, I began then going back and forth, or to and fro, if you will.
Uh-huh. What I have to say that the protagonist who's set the fro part, which is set in the present, you've always been so good at capturing that adolescent voice. I just am always blown away, and her story and her relationships with her mother, with her brother, with the rabbi who comes in to talk to her. Um, you made her so real to me. I just thought, God, Leah, that's so. How'd you do that? How'd you do that?
I don't know about you, Nancy, but I feel like this is a little bit gendered, maybe. Um, the freedom and the power that a pre-adolescent, on the cusp of adolescence girl has, and then sadly, usually loses some measure of once she crosses that line into adolescence and adulthood. I am so drawn to the possibility and adventure and delight that I associate with that, with a female child who's as old as you can be and still identify as a child.
One of the things that I was so impressed with about the book is the way this two section and the fro section talk to one another. Not literally, but the experiences of the two young women kind of reflect and refract from one another. Did that come, if you could ever say anything in writing comes naturally, was that something that you were conscious of when you were writing, the kind of need to connect them in particular ways?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question because I think I was actually incredibly resistant to anything that would feel like forcing the echoes and the mirrorings. And I knew that in some ways it might be a book that would be more legible and more readily received by readers if I orchestrated that part a bit more. And I didn't want to, and I think I constitutionally was unable to. I wanted to respect the organic ways that certain echoes and mirrorings emerged. Um, but I was always really wary of overemphasizing that or plotting that. So I think in early drafts, I was very aware of it, but it was so subtle that it was maybe not so legible to readers who weren't me. And at one point, my wonderful agent, who I've been with for more than 33 years, who knows me really well, um, he said, if you could just make more palpable for readers what is spiritually obvious to you, think about that. And that was the perfect thing to say to me because he was affirming that there was something spiritually true and really, really obvious to me. And yet I didn't want to be obscure or difficult I wanted to share this with other people. And this idea that he offered to me, if I could just, like when you're with children and you want to say it in a way that your children can understand, of course I want to try to do that better. And so I think that helped me I hope tip the balance over into making those connections something that readers could see and take pleasure in.
And I don't think it's the kind of in your face, a connection. Like you don't read a sentence and say, "Oh, I read something very much like that sentence in the other part." I mean, it's subtle things. Like it didn't occur to me until I was taking the bus here this morning that that in the to section there's a kitten named Company, and in the fro section the main character has a journal, a book that she is attached to in the same way that the to girl is attached to the cat, and that she names that book Company, Coco for short. And then I thought, oh wow, I didn't really pick that up when I was reading the book.
I think, in a way, I'm glad that it only occurred to you later, that again, that it wasn't like, I can see what she's doing,
Right, right.
but it's because that was my experience writing the book, that these moments of correspondence, they occurred to me as they emerged on the paper, and caused me such not only a sense of delight, but a sense of trust and groundedness, that there was some kind of there, and my job was just to try to perceive it.
And have the readers perceive it without feeling that it was made, that it was
Yeah.
constructed. Yeah. Is this the most spiritual book that you've written? And if so, what led to this?
So when you just said, to not have this sense that it was made, but more that I was writing towards something that exists outside of myself, um, that to me is like the spiritual core of making art. This, whenever we can sort of move our own designs and egos out of the way and become channels for something that doesn't originate with us, that like that's what I'm in it for. That's what is alive for me. So yeah, I would say this book is most certainly the most spiritual thing that I've written. And I think that's part of what made it by far the hardest thing I've attempted. And it's so, I mean, you're making it relatively easy and enjoyable, but it's hard for me to speak about it too,
Mm-hmm.
because I'm writing about the ineffable.
Right. Is that what Kafka's writing about too? Is that what draws you to Kafka?
Far be it from me to imagine what, what would he have said. But yes, I certainly find that he creates containers, amazing, perfect containers for the ineffable in his work.
What shape are they?
Yeah, have you seen his drawings? He has these like really thick, heavy, like pen and ink drawings. I don't know if some of them almost look like with a paintbrush and black ink.
Oh, I
Um,
didn't know that.
yeah, so that's the image that comes to mind when you ask your beautiful question, what shape are they? They're like shapes that do not have names in known geometry.
If someone, um, what books would you recommend to someone who loved to and fro? Are there? That's a hard question.
So what comes right to mind for me is someone who I feel very inspired by, and I only discovered, I think I had already begun to and fro, but it was during the process of working on that book that I discovered Olga Tokarczuk, the Polish Nobel laureate. I guess it was first the Books of Jacob, this like 1,000-page novel of hers. That I read, but then subsequently, the one I fell even much more in love with is Primeval and Other Times.
Oh.
It's an amazing book and very hard to describe or categorize.
So you teach writing still, right?
Yes,
To college students.
yes.
Yes. What advice? Well, let me back up. What's the best piece of writing advice that you got when you were beginning? And your first book was the memoir, Train Go Sorry, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
yeah.
loved that book. I still have
Mm.
it on my
You're,
bookshelf.
you're so kind to me. Thank you. I I guess the best piece of writing advice I got, and it came through a few different teachers and important and mentors and nurturers in my life, was, and I don't know that it was ever stated as such, but this is what I absorbed, to not to take myself seriously, or not to be self-serious, but to take the work seriously. And like that, there's so much humility in that, right?
Right.
And you can be 100% playful in a way that is deeply serious and almost reverential.
That opens up a lot of avenues for discussion. That's to 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 step back from it and take the work seriously, but not you seriously. I think, first of all, I think it's probably very hard to get one's own ego out of the equation.
I struggle on a
Yes,
daily
right,
basis with
right,
that.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you do it? I mean, it can't be, again, it can't be like this obvious, I'm not taking myself seriously. My ego is nowhere in there. But because to some extent your ego has to be in there because it's a part of you that you can't shut
Mm.
off.
Well, you are a writer too, and I imagine you know the experience that once you've cleared aside all the, you've charged your computer, done the dishes, like all the things that get in the way, that once you're there and you've done a little throat clearing and you're in it, don't like you lose yourself. I
Right.
completely
That's right.
lose
Yeah.
myself. When I'm in it, thank goodness, there is no ego when I'm in it. I really am in the service of, or maybe, I don't know, or just being like a very good playmate
Mm-hmm.
to this process. I think of it as being like when you're a little kid, you're in the sandbox, maybe with friends, you're working on something, you're building and shoveling and like you lose yourself in the best way. And it's at once deeply playful and deeply serious. And for me, in those moments, I don't have to work to get my ego out of the way. It's all the rest of the time. Yeah.
I mean, there's a poem by Reed Whittemore called, I think it's by Reed Whittemore, called Clamming, which I think that you would enjoy reading the poem. But one of the lines is, "The self, what a brute it is. It wants," and then goes on from there. Isn't that a good line?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will look that poem up.
Okay. All right. And you have actually my email, so if you can't find it, I'm happy to send it along. Um, what's the worst bit of advice that you got as a young writer?
Anything to do with focus on uh, external recognition, approbation, that has always been super damaging, whether I'm sort of receiving a positive review, which comes with an initial sense of, giddy elation, and then I firmly believe quickly becomes toxic, or whether it's because I'm receiving, negative critical responses or no critical attention at all, whatever happens externally, um, for me is ultimately toxic, I guess, because then I get in my own way again.
Yeah, and then it comes back to that whole question of ego and what's been hurt and that kind of thing. Is that what you share with your students when you give them, like, what advice? How do you get your students to get out of their own way?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes the very first day of class, we do an exercise where I ask them to write on one side of an index card, what are your wildest dreams for yourself as a writer, as an artist, as a person? And then on the other side of the index card, what gets in your way? Um, and then sometimes we do rituals with these pieces of paper. And I do think, Nancy, I'm really fortunate to teach only undergrads and virtually no students or very, very few students who have their sights set on being capital W writers, you know. And so what's lovely is that's just mostly not what we're um, collaborating on together. We're coming together in community. We're exploring like what does it mean to be free and how can language and narrative, be part of a process of figuring out what it means to be alive in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have taught in an MFA program, and I realize I'm much less happy if I'm being asked to support students going down a sort of professional path,
Right.
'cause I don't
Right.
know how to do that.
Yeah. Right. When was there a book or an author at the beginning of your writing career that really influenced you?
There's so many. And when you say the beginning of my writing career, what I think of, this might not be what you meant, but I think of being, like 4 years old when I couldn't even write yet. And I was making up stories and my mom would write them down for me. Like, so it's
Yeah.
early.
Yeah.
I, a big one for me actually was when I was maybe in elementary school and discovered E. E. Cummings. And I thought, oh, you can be like a grown up and play and sort of like dismantle the rules and play within those dismantlings and find these free spaces, these spaces of possibility. Oh, I didn't know you could do that even once you've become a grown up.
Wow.
That felt precious to learn.
And in this interview, we've talked a lot about play and the importance of play. And is that obviously it's not if you were influenced if you were aware of that when you were reading Cummings, so it's not something new. But when did it become this? And this is my last question, a hard question, I think. When did it become central to you that play was necessary in your life and in your writing?
I think that I'm sure, an insufferable young woman who took I did what perhaps a lot of adolescents and young adults do and thought like, oh, the way you cross that threshold from childhood to, adulthood is, you have to be very serious. And I think I played a version of myself that was more serious and weighty than I actually felt myself to be. And I think it's only, thank goodness, as I've gotten older. Today's my birthday. I'm
Oh,
57 today.
oh, happy birthday.
Thank
Happy
you.
birthday.
And I love feeling as though the older I get, the more I have I'm able to grant myself permission
Yeah.
to, drink from that well of playfulness and recognize in that something powerful and powerfully good.
Wow. All right, Leah, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And I won't say good luck because that seems to, but how about happiness and lots of play in your books to come?
Nancy, thank you. It's beautiful to talk with you.